when my neighbor Jessica Martinez stood on my doorstep at 9:30 at night, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. She had no idea that every word she was about to say was being recorded in crystal-clear high definition. "Your time is up, old lady," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can hide behind your little fence and your pathetic flowers? But I'm going to make your life hell until you sell this dump and get out of my neighborhood." What she didn't know was that I had just spent 3 months installing a state-of-the-art security system that would capture every threat, every lie, and every illegal action she was about to take. But here's what really happened, and how a 72-year-old retired librarian used technology to expose the truth about a woman who thought she could bully me out of the home I'd lived in for 37 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Chen, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew what neighborhood drama looked like. I'd lived at 847 Maple Grove Drive in Riverside, California since 1987, when my late husband David and I bought our modest 2-bedroom ranch house for what seemed like an enormous sum at the time. We'd raised our daughter there, hosted countless barbecues in the backyard, and watched the neighborhood grow and change around us. When David passed 5 years ago from complications related to his diabetes, I assumed I'd spend my remaining years quietly tending to my garden, reading my books, and enjoying the peaceful retirement we'd always planned together. The house next door had been home to the Hendersons for nearly as long as we'd lived there. Frank and Margaret Henderson were the kind of neighbors you dream about. Quiet, respectful, always ready to help with a kind word or a borrowed cup of sugar. When Frank had his heart attack 3 years ago, I was one of the people who organized meal trains and helped Margaret with yard work. When Margaret decided she needed to move closer to her children in Arizona after Frank passed, I was genuinely sad to see her go. She sold the house last spring to a young couple, and I looked forward to meeting my new neighbors. Jessica Martinez and her husband Miguel moved in during the first week of June. They were both in their early 30s, clearly successful based on the expensive cars they drove and the immediate renovations they began on the Henderson house. At first I was optimistic. Jessica worked in real estate, Miguel was some kind of tech consultant, and they seemed like the type of young professionals who would appreciate the quiet, established character of our street. I even baked them a welcome cake, my famous lemon pound cake that had been a hit at church bake sales for decades. When I knocked on their door that first Saturday morning in June, carrying my cake plate and wearing my best smile, I had no idea I was about to meet someone who would turn my peaceful retirement into a nightmare. Jessica answered the door wearing expensive athleisure wear, her dark hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and looked at me like I was a door-to-door salesman she had no interest in entertaining. "Can I help you?" she asked, not bothering to open the door more than halfway. I introduced myself, explained that I'd lived next door for decades, and offered her the cake. She looked at it like I was handing her a plate of garbage. "Oh, we don't really eat homemade food from people we don't know," she said with a dismissive smile. "Food safety and all that. But thanks anyway." She closed the door before I could even respond, leaving me standing on her porch with my rejected cake and a growing sense that this relationship was going to be more complicated than I'd hoped. The problems started small. Jessica and Miguel immediately began what they called, quote, updating the property. The Henderson house had been a charming blue colonial, with white shutters and a picket fence that complemented the established character of our neighborhood. Within 2 weeks, they'd painted it a stark modern gray, removed the picket fence, and installed a tall black metal fence that made their property look like a fortress. They ripped out Margaret's beautiful rose garden and replaced it with geometric concrete, planters filled with spiky architectural plants that looked more suited to an office building than a residential neighborhood. I tried to be understanding. They were young, they had different tastes, and it was their property. But then the noise started. Construction crews arrived every morning at 7 sharp, which was legal, according to city ordinances, but inconsiderate given that most of the neighborhood was occupied by retirees, who didn't appreciate being awakened by power tools and hammering. The work continued until 6 in the evening, every single day, including weekends. When I finally worked up the courage to speak to Jessica about the noise, approaching her one evening as she got out of her Tesla, she looked at me with barely concealed irritation. Mrs. Chen, this is a residential neighborhood where people are allowed to improve their properties, she said, pronouncing my name wrong despite my having corrected her twice. If you can't handle the sounds of progress, maybe you should consider moving somewhere more suited to your needs. Like a retirement community. The way she said retirement community made it clear she thought I was some doddering old woman who didn't belong in her upgraded neighborhood. At 72, I was still sharp, still active, still perfectly capable of living independently in the home I'd maintained beautifully for nearly 4 decades. But Jessica had made up her mind about who I was and where I belonged. The situation escalated when Jessica decided that my fence was negatively impacting her property value. The fence between our properties was a simple 6-foot wooden privacy fence that David and Frank Henderson had built together in 1995. It was well maintained, properly positioned on the property line, and had never caused any issues with the Henderson family. But Jessica wanted it gone. She appeared at my door on a Tuesday morning in August, dressed in her real estate agent attire, carrying a folder full of papers. "Mrs. Chen, I've had a property surveyor out, and I need to discuss some boundary issues with you," she announced, pushing past me into my living room without invitation. She spread out surveys and property maps on my coffee table, pointing to various lines and measurements that meant nothing to me. "The issue," she continued in her professional voice, "is that your fence is encroaching on my property by approximately 6 inches along the eastern boundary. According to California property law, I have the right to require you to move it." She had clearly done her homework, citing various codes and regulations, with the confidence of someone accustomed to using legal language to intimidate people. I explained that the fence had been surveyed and approved when it was originally built, that I had all the original permits and documentation, and that the Henderson family had never raised any concerns about its placement. Jessica dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand. "Previous owners may have been willing to overlook property line issues, but I'm not. I'm giving you 30 days to relocate your fence to the proper boundary line. If you don't, I'll be forced to take legal action." Legal action. Over 6 inches of fence line that had been undisputed for nearly 30 years. I spent the next week consulting with a property attorney, who reviewed all my documentation and confirmed that my fence was legally positioned and that I had no obligation to move it. When I shared this information with Jessica, she became hostile in a way that shocked me. "Listen, old lady," she said, standing in my driveway with her hands on her hips. "I don't care what some lawyer told you. This neighborhood is changing, and people like you need to adapt or get out. I'm not going to let your outdated property drag down my investment." The mask of professional politeness had completely fallen away, revealing someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her plans. That's when I realized I was dealing with someone who intended to bully me out of my home, and I needed to start protecting myself. At 72, I wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but I understood that in disputes like this, documentation was everything. If Jessica was going to escalate her harassment, I wanted to make sure I had evidence of exactly what she was doing. I'd never considered installing a security system before. Riverside wasn't a high-crime area, and I'd always felt safe.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
In my neighborhood. But I started researching security cameras and recording systems, learning about resolution quality, night vision capabilities, and cloud storage options. It was like learning a new language, but I was determined to master it. The system I ultimately chose was more sophisticated than anything I'd ever imagined needing. Motion-activated cameras with audio recording, positioned to cover my front door, backyard, and the entire boundary between our properties. A doorbell camera that would capture anyone who approached my house. Interior cameras connected to a cloud-based system that would preserve recordings, even if someone tried to destroy the equipment. The whole setup cost me nearly $4,000. But after 37 years of homeownership, I had enough savings to make the investment. The installation took 2 days. The technician, a patient young man named Carlos, explained how to access the system from my tablet, how to review recordings, and how to download video files if I needed them for legal purposes. He taught me about motion sensitivity settings, night vision modes, and how the system would automatically alert me to any unusual activity. By the time he finished, I had what he described as commercial-grade security for a residential property. The system was fully operational by the third week of September. Within days, it was capturing behavior from Jessica that made me realize her harassment was far more extensive and deliberate than I'd understood. She was walking through my garden when she thought I wasn't home, taking photos of my property, and having loud phone conversations in her backyard about, quote, getting rid of the old woman next door. One particularly disturbing recording captured Jessica on the phone with someone, possibly her husband, saying, quote, she's got to be at least 80, maybe older. How long can she really hold on to that place? If we keep the pressure up, she'll probably just give up and move to one of those senior places. Then we can buy her lot cheap and expand our property. They weren't just harassing me for the sake of harassment. They had a plan to acquire my property, and they saw my age as a weakness they could exploit. The recordings revealed a calculated campaign designed to make my life so uncomfortable that I'd sell my home and leave the neighborhood. But what they didn't understand was that I wasn't the fragile, confused elderly woman they thought I was. I was someone who'd spent 40 years as a research librarian, trained to gather information, document facts, and build compelling cases based on evidence. The behavior escalated through October. Jessica began filing noise complaints about me with the city, claiming that my lawnmower was too loud, that I was playing music too late at night, and that my garbage cans were creating unsanitary conditions on the street. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed, but the process was stressful and time-consuming. She also started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my car windshield, usually typed and unsigned, with messages like, "Some people need to recognize when they don't belong," and "Change is inevitable, resistance is futile." My security system captured her placing these notes, always when she thought no one was watching, always careful to avoid showing her face to what she assumed were non-existent cameras. She had no idea that high-definition video was recording her every move, storing everything in a cloud system that she couldn't access or destroy. The breaking point came on Halloween night. I'd always enjoyed Halloween, decorating my front yard with jack-o', lanterns and autumn displays, handing out candy to neighborhood children. This year felt particularly important because it was my first Halloween without David, and I wanted to maintain the traditions we'd established together. I spent the afternoon carving pumpkins and setting up my display, looking forward to seeing the costumes and smiles of trick-or-treaters. Jessica had different plans for the evening. Around 8 o'clock, as I was handing out candy to a group of young pirates and princesses, she appeared at the end of my driveway, dressed in dark clothing, carrying what appeared to be a bag of some kind. She waited until the children had moved on to the next house, then walked purposefully toward my front door. What happened next was captured in perfect detail by my security system. Jessica didn't ring the doorbell or knock. Instead, she began kicking over my jack-o', lanterns, smashing them against my driveway and scattering pumpkin chunks across my lawn. She tore down my autumn decorations, throwing them into the street, and knocked over the small scarecrow I'd positioned by my front steps. When I opened my door to see what was happening, she looked directly at me with fury I'd never seen from another human being. "Your time is up, old lady," she said, her voice cold and threatening. "You think you can hide behind your little fence and your pathetic flowers, but I'm going to make your life hell until you sell this dump and get out of my neighborhood," she continued, pointing her finger at me like a weapon. "You don't belong here anymore. This is a neighborhood for successful people, people with futures, not some ancient relic clinging to the past. I'm going to file noise complaints until the city forces you out. I'm going to document every code violation on your property until they condemn this shack. I'm going to make every single day of your life so miserable that you'll be begging to leave." I stood in my doorway, trembling not with fear but with rage, as this woman who was young enough to be my daughter threatened to destroy the life I'd built in the home I'd loved for nearly 4 decades. But I didn't respond. I didn't argue or defend myself or try to reason with her. Instead, I quietly closed my door and went to my tablet to review the crystal-clear video recording of every word she'd just said. Jessica had no idea that she'd just provided me with exactly the evidence I needed to end her campaign of harassment once and for all. She thought she was intimidating a helpless old woman who had no recourse against her threats. What she'd actually done was confess to a systematic plan of harassment while being recorded by a security system that would preserve her words forever. The next morning, I called my attorney, uploaded the Halloween recording along with weeks of other documented incidents, and began the process that would teach Jessica Martinez exactly who she was dealing with. Because at 72 years old, I might be old, but I certainly wasn't helpless. And I was about to prove that threatening someone who'd spent 4 decades mastering research and documentation was a very serious mistake. The evidence I'd collected was more comprehensive than even I had realized. When I sat down with my attorney, Rebecca Santos, the following Monday morning, she spent over an hour reviewing the recordings, documents, and timeline I'd prepared. Rebecca was in her 40s, sharp and professional, and had handled several neighbor dispute cases over the years. But she told me she'd never seen such thorough documentation of harassment behavior. "Eleanor, this is extraordinary work," she said, scrolling through the video files on her computer. "You've captured systematic harassment, threats, property destruction, and what appears to be a conspiracy to force you from your home. This isn't just a neighbor dispute. This is potentially criminal behavior." The Halloween recording was the centerpiece, but the supporting evidence painted a picture of months of calculated intimidation. Jessica's voice on recorded phone calls discussing plans to get rid of the old woman, video of her placing threatening notes on my car, documentation of frivolous complaints filed with the city, photos she'd taken of my property without permission, even recordings of her discussing my age and perceived vulnerability as tactical advantages in her campaign to acquire my property. Rebecca explained that Jessica's behavior constituted harassment under California law, potentially rising to the level of stalking given the sustained and threatening nature of her actions. The property destruction caught on camera was vandalism. Her stated plan to file false complaints with city agencies could be considered harassment of a public official. Most seriously, her threats to make my life hell until I moved could be prosecuted as criminal threats. "What are my options?" I asked, feeling more empowered than I had in months. Rebecca outlined several approaches, ranging from civil harassment restraining orders to criminal complaints to civil lawsuits for damages and emotional distress. She recommended starting with a comprehensive demand letter, backed by the video evidence, that would make clear to Jessica exactly how much trouble she was in. The letter Rebecca prepared was devastating in its precision. It detailed every incident of harassment, referenced specific California statutes that Jessica had violated, and included timestamps for key video recordings that proved her actions. It demanded immediate cessation of all harassment, written apologies for her behavior, and compensation for the property damage she'd caused. Most importantly, it made clear that failure to comply would result in both civil and criminal legal action. We sent the letter by certified mail on a Thursday morning in early November. Jessica received it Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, my security system captured her reaction, and it was everything I could have hoped for. The first indication that the letter had hit its mark came when I saw Jessica's husband Miguel arrive home early from work on Friday, something that had never happened in the months they'd lived next door. My audio pickup caught fragments of what sounded like a very intense conversation taking place in their backyard, with Jessica's voice raised and Miguel's responses sounding increasingly angry. Saturday morning brought the full meltdown. Jessica emerged from her house around 9 o'clock, still in her pajamas, carrying what appeared to be the legal demand letter. She walked directly to the fence line between our properties and began shouting at my house, apparently assuming I was inside and would come out to confront her. "You think you're so smart with your little cameras and your lawyer letters?" she screamed, waving the papers in the air. "I'm not scared of some old woman who thinks she can hide behind technology." The irony of her claiming I was hiding behind technology, while she'd spent months trying to hide her harassment from non-existent witnesses, was lost on her. But my security system captured every word. She continued her rant for nearly 10 minutes, threatening to, quote, double down on her efforts to get me to move, promising that she'd, quote, find ways around your stupid cameras, and making it clear that she saw the legal letter as a challenge rather than a warning. Every threat, every promise of continued harassment, every admission of her previous behavior was recorded in high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. By Sunday, Jessica had apparently consulted with her own attorney, because her tone changed dramatically. Miguel appeared at my door Sunday evening, looking embarrassed and defeated, asking if he could speak with me privately. I agreed to talk with him, but I also made sure to activate the record function on my doorbell camera before opening the door. "Mrs. Chen," he began, clearly uncomfortable, "I want to apologize for my wife's behavior. I had no idea she'd been harassing you like this until she showed me the letter from your lawyer. This isn't who I am, and it's not who I want to be as a neighbor." Miguel explained that Jessica had been under enormous pressure at work, that she'd been dealing with difficult clients and failed real estate deals, and that she'd somehow focused all her frustration on me as a symbol of everything she felt was holding her back. He acknowledged that none of this excused her behavior, but he wanted me to understand that it wasn't personal, even though it had certainly felt personal to me. "Is Jessica prepared to take responsibility for what she's done?" I asked him directly. Miguel nodded, saying that their attorney had explained exactly how much legal trouble she was facing, and that she was ready to make things right. He asked if there was any way we could resolve the situation without involving the courts, for the sake of everyone involved. I told Miguel that I'd consider their response, but that I needed to see concrete actions, not just promises. Jessica would need to provide written apologies for her behavior, compensation for the property damage she'd caused, and most importantly, a legally binding agreement that she would cease all harassment and respect my right to live peacefully in my home. The formal settlement agreement took 2 weeks to negotiate, but the results exceeded even my expectations. Jessica provided a written apology that acknowledged her harassment, admitted that her behavior was wrong, and committed to treating me with the respect I deserved as a long-term member of the community. She paid for the replacement of my Halloween decorations and the damage to my landscaping caused by her vandalism. Most importantly, she signed a comprehensive restraining agreement that prohibited any further harassment, required her to maintain civil and respectful behavior, and established severe financial penalties if she violated the terms. The agreement was legally binding and could be enforced through the courts if necessary. But the real victory wasn't the legal settlement. The real victory was the change in how I was treated, not just by Jessica, but by the entire neighborhood. Word had spread about the dispute and its resolution, and suddenly, I found myself being approached by other neighbors who shared their own experiences with difficult residents, who asked for advice about property disputes, and who expressed admiration for how I'd handled the situation. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 houses down told me she'd been dealing with noise issues from another neighbor and asked if I could recommend my security system installer. Bob Patterson, a retired teacher who lived across the street, confessed that he'd been intimidated by some of the younger, more aggressive residents and felt inspired by my example to stand up for himself. Most surprisingly, I began receiving calls from other elderly residents throughout Riverside who'd heard about my case and wanted advice on dealing with harassment from neighbors, landlords, or even family members who underestimated their capabilities and rights. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for senior citizens who refused to be pushed around or dismissed because of their age. The security system that I'd installed to protect myself from Jessica had become something much more valuable. It had given me confidence, documentation capabilities, and most importantly, proof that age didn't make me helpless or defenseless. At 72, I was still perfectly capable of learning new technology, gathering evidence, and fighting back against people who tried to take advantage of me. 6 months later, my relationship with Jessica and Miguel had evolved into something approaching normal neighborly civility. Jessica still wasn't friendly, but she was respectful. She acknowledged me when we encountered each other outside, kept her property neat, and had never again exhibited any of the harassment behavior that had dominated our early interactions. More importantly, I'd discovered capabilities and strengths I didn't know I possessed. The research skills I'd developed during my library career translated perfectly to legal documentation. The patience and attention to detail that had served me well in academic research proved invaluable in building a comprehensive case against harassment. The technological systems I'd learned to operate had given me tools for self-protection that I'd never imagined needing. My security system continued to serve its purpose, but now I used it proactively rather than defensively. I could monitor package deliveries, check on visitors when I was away from home, and maintain awareness of neighborhood activities. The confidence it provided extended far beyond my interactions with Jessica and influenced how I approached other challenges in my life. When my insurance company initially tried to minimize a claim related to storm damage on my roof, I had documentation of the damage timeline that supported my position. When a contractor attempted to overcharge me for yard work, I had recordings of our original price negotiations that protected me from inflated billing. The tools I'd acquired to defend myself from one harassing neighbor had applications throughout my life. The college courses I took in digital security and privacy rights expanded my understanding even further. I learned about data protection, online safety, and digital rights for seniors. I began volunteering with a local senior center, teaching other older adults about technology tools that could help them maintain independence and protect themselves from various forms of exploitation. The transformation from victim to advocate hadn't been part of my original plan, but it had given my retirement a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. Instead of spending my days quietly reading and gardening, I was actively engaged with my community, helping other people solve problems, and challenging stereotypes about what older adults could accomplish when we refused to be dismissed or intimidated. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that Jessica had inadvertently done me a favor. Her harassment had forced me to discover strengths, learn new skills, and develop capabilities that had enriched my life in ways I never would have imagined. She'd tried to make me feel powerless and out of place in my own neighborhood, but instead she'd helped me become more powerful and more connected to my community than I'd been in years. The security system that captured her threats had become a symbol of something much larger. It represented my refusal to be victimized, my commitment to fighting back against people who tried to take advantage of perceived weakness, and my determination to live my life on my own terms regardless of what anyone else thought about my age or my place in the world. At 72, I wasn't slowing down. I was speeding up, learning more, doing more, and helping more people than I had in decades. And it had all started with a woman who thought she could threaten me into disappearing quietly from my own life. Instead, she'd helped me discover that I was just getting started. The weeks following Jessica's formal settlement brought an unexpected development that changed my understanding of the entire situation. While reviewing archived footage from my security system, I discovered that the harassment I'd experienced was only part of a much larger pattern of behavior that extended throughout our neighborhood. The high-resolution cameras I'd installed captured not just activities on my property, but also incidents occurring on the street, in neighboring yards, and around the community that revealed Jessica's true character. During my systematic review of several months of recordings, I found evidence that Jessica had been targeting multiple elderly residents in our area. Mrs. Patterson, the 80-year-old widow who lived 2 houses down, had been receiving similar threatening notes left on her car. Mr. Kim, a retired professor across the street, had been dealing with repeated noise complaints filed against him for activities like using his leaf blower during legal hours. The Gonzalez family, an older couple who'd lived on Maple Grove Drive for over 20 years, had been subjected to harassment about their front yard decorations and garden choices. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was the calculated nature of Jessica's approach. She wasn't randomly lashing out at neighbors who annoyed her. She was systematically targeting the most vulnerable residents in our community, people she perceived as unable or unwilling to fight back against her intimidation tactics. Her real estate background had given her access to property records, demographic information, and financial data that she was using to identify targets for her harassment campaigns. The recordings revealed that Jessica had been conducting what amounted to reconnaissance missions through our neighborhood. She would walk or drive slowly past houses, taking photographs of properties, documenting what she clearly considered to be violations of her standards for the area. She had been building files on multiple residents, gathering information she could use to pressure people into changing their behavior or even leaving the neighborhood entirely. One particularly damning recording captured a phone conversation Jessica had while standing in her backyard, apparently believing that no one could hear her. She was speaking to someone about her neighborhood improvement project and describing her strategy for upgrading the demographic profile of Maple Grove Drive. She specifically mentioned targeting households where she believed the residents were too old to fight back effectively or financially vulnerable to pressure. This wasn't random neighbor harassment. This was a coordinated campaign designed to reshape our entire community by forcing out residents Jessica considered undesirable. The scope of her activities was far more extensive and far more malicious than I had initially understood. She had turned neighborhood management into a kind of real estate speculation, hoping to drive down property values by creating instability, then potentially acquiring properties cheaply when stressed residents decided to sell. Armed with this broader understanding of Jessica's activities, I faced a moral dilemma about how to respond. My legal settlement with her had resolved my personal situation, but it had done nothing to protect the other residents who were still being targeted by her harassment campaigns. I could document the evidence I'd gathered and turn it over to law enforcement, but that would likely lead to criminal charges that might destroy her career and her marriage. Alternatively, I could use the information I'd collected as leverage to force her to cease all harassment activities throughout the neighborhood. After considerable reflection, I decided that my primary obligation was to protect my fellow residents from ongoing harassment, regardless of the personal consequences for Jessica. I arranged a meeting with Rebecca Santos to discuss the broader implications of what I'd discovered and to explore options for addressing Jessica's community-wide harassment campaign. Rebecca reviewed the additional evidence I'd collected and immediately recognized the serious legal implications of Jessica's behavior. The pattern of targeted harassment based on age and perceived vulnerability could constitute elder abuse under California law. Her systematic campaign to force residents from their homes might qualify as criminal conspiracy. Most seriously, her use of false complaints and fraudulent reports to government agencies could result in felony charges. Eleanor, what you've uncovered here goes far beyond a neighbor dispute, Rebecca explained during our meeting. This appears to be a systematic pattern of criminal harassment targeting vulnerable populations. We're not just talking about civil remedies anymore. This could involve criminal prosecution and federal civil rights violations. The evidence I'd gathered painted a picture of someone who had weaponized the legal system, government bureaucracy, and social pressure to terrorize elderly residents into abandoning their homes. Jessica's real estate expertise had given her knowledge of exactly which pressure points would be most effective against different types of targets, and she had been applying that knowledge with calculated precision. Rebecca recommended that we compile a comprehensive report documenting all of Jessica's harassment activities and present it simultaneously to local law enforcement, the district attorney's office, and the California Department of Consumer Affairs, which regulated real estate licenses. The systematic nature of her behavior and her use of professional knowledge to target vulnerable populations meant that she was violating not just criminal laws, but also the ethical standards required to maintain her real estate license. However, before pursuing criminal charges, Rebecca suggested that we give Jessica one final opportunity to voluntarily cease her activities and make amends to the residents she'd been targeting. We would present her with the evidence we'd collected and offer her a choice: immediately stop all harassment activities and provide restitution to affected residents, or face the full consequences of criminal prosecution and professional sanctions. The comprehensive report we prepared was devastating in its scope and detail. Over 60 pages of documentation included video evidence, audio recordings, photographs, and timeline analysis that demonstrated a sustained campaign of harassment targeting at least 8 households in our immediate neighborhood. The report detailed Jessica's methods, identified her targets, and documented the specific harms she had caused to each affected family. We scheduled a meeting with Jessica and her attorney for a Thursday afternoon in early December. I had mixed feelings about the confrontation. On one hand, I felt a sense of justice about holding her accountable for behavior that had affected so many innocent people. On the other hand, I recognized that the evidence we'd gathered could potentially destroy her career and her life, consequences that seemed disproportionate to the actual harm she'd caused. Jessica arrived at the meeting accompanied by her husband Miguel and a different attorney than the one who had handled our previous settlement. She looked nervous and defensive, clearly aware that this meeting involved more than just our resolved neighbor dispute. When Rebecca began presenting the evidence we'd collected, Jessica's expression shifted from nervousness to shock to what appeared to be genuine fear. The timeline of her harassment activities, presented with video evidence and audio recordings, made clear that her behavior toward me had been part of a much larger pattern of criminal conduct. Rebecca methodically walked through each household Jessica had targeted, each illegal action she had taken, and each law she had violated in her campaign to reshape our neighborhood according to her preferences. "Mrs. Martinez," Rebecca said, addressing Jessica directly, "the evidence we've presented demonstrates that you have been engaged in systematic criminal harassment of elderly residents throughout your neighborhood. You have filed false complaints with government agencies, threatened vulnerable individuals, destroyed property, and used your professional knowledge to identify and exploit targets for your harassment campaigns." Jessica's attorney requested a recess to consult with his client privately. When they returned after 20 minutes, Jessica looked pale and shaken. Her attorney explained that they understood the seriousness of the charges they could be facing and were prepared to discuss resolution options that would avoid criminal prosecution. The settlement terms we proposed were comprehensive and non-negotiable. Jessica would provide written apologies to every household she had harassed, acknowledging her behavior and accepting full responsibility for the distress she had caused. She would pay restitution to each affected family for any damages or expenses they had incurred as a result of her actions. Most importantly, she would agree to a legally binding restraining order that prohibited any further harassment of any resident in our neighborhood, with severe financial penalties for any violations. Additionally, Jessica would be required to attend anger management counseling and community service focused on elder care, helping her understand the impact of her behavior on vulnerable populations. She would also surrender her real estate license voluntarily, rather than face professional disciplinary action that would become part of her permanent record. The terms were harsh, but they reflected the scope of Jessica's misconduct and the number of people who had been harmed by her actions. Her alternative was criminal prosecution that could result in felony charges, imprisonment, and the permanent destruction of her career and reputation. After another consultation with her attorney, Jessica accepted the settlement terms. The signing process took place the following week, with each affected household receiving individual apologies and restitution payments. Jessica acknowledged that her behavior had been wrong, illegal, and harmful to innocent people who deserved to live peacefully in their own homes. The transformation in our neighborhood following Jessica's settlement was remarkable. Mrs. Patterson, who had been living in fear of continued harassment, began spending time in her garden again and started hosting small social gatherings for neighbors. Mr. Kim resumed his daily walks through the community and began offering tutoring services to local students. The Gonzalez family expanded their front yard garden and invited neighbors to share in the vegetables they grew. Most importantly, the resolution of Jessica's harassment campaign created a sense of community solidarity that hadn't existed before. Neighbors who had been isolated by fear and intimidation began talking to each other, sharing their experiences and building relationships based on mutual support, rather than shared victimization. I found myself serving as an informal coordinator for these new community connections. My experience with technology and documentation had given me skills that other residents found valuable, and I began helping neighbors with various challenges that required research, evidence gathering, or advocacy with government agencies or service providers. When Mrs. Peterson needed help disputing an incorrect property tax assessment, I taught her how to photograph and document the evidence she needed to support her appeal. When the Gonzalez family faced discrimination from a contractor who tried to overcharge them based on assumptions about their English proficiency, I helped them gather comparative quotes and file complaints with appropriate agencies. The security system that had initially been installed to protect me from one harassing neighbor had evolved into a community resource that helped multiple families document and resolve various problems. The confidence and skills I had developed through confronting Jessica's harassment had applications that extended far beyond my original situation. 6 months after the settlement, I received an unexpected visit from Jessica. She appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon, looking nervous but determined. She asked if she could speak with me privately about something important. Given our history, I was cautious about the request, but I agreed to listen to what she had to say. "Mrs. Chen," she began, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance to resolve this situation without criminal prosecution. I know you could have destroyed my life completely, and you chose not to do that. I've been in therapy for the past 6 months, and I'm beginning to understand how much damage I caused and how wrong my behavior was." Jessica explained that her harassment campaign had grown out of work stress, financial pressure, and a distorted belief that she could control her environment by controlling the people around her. She had convinced herself that older residents were obstacles to neighborhood improvement rather than valued community members with their own rights and dignity. The counseling she was required to attend had helped her understand that her behavior toward elderly residents reflected deeper problems with how she viewed aging, vulnerability, and her own fears about growing older. She had been projecting her anxieties about losing control and relevance onto people who represented the life stage she was afraid of reaching herself. "I want you to know that I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued. "I don't deserve that, and I understand if you never want to have a relationship with me. But I needed you to know that your response to my harassment taught me things about strength and dignity that I never understood before. You showed me what it looks like to stand up for yourself without destroying other people in the process." Jessica's apology was more thoughtful and genuine than I had expected. She had clearly spent considerable time reflecting on her behavior and its impact on the people she had targeted. While I wasn't ready to consider her a friend, I appreciated her acknowledgement of the harm she had caused and her apparent commitment to different behavior going forward. The experience of confronting and resolving Jessica's harassment had changed my understanding of my own capabilities and my role in the community. At 72, I had discovered that age brought wisdom and experience that could be powerful tools for protecting myself and helping others. The stereotype of elderly people as vulnerable and helpless had been replaced by a reality where I was more capable and more influential than I had been at any previous point in my life. The technology skills I had learned out of necessity had opened up new possibilities for staying connected, informed, and engaged with the world around me. The legal knowledge I had acquired through fighting harassment had given me tools for advocating for myself and others in various situations. The confidence I had gained through successfully standing up to intimidation had made me more willing to take on challenges and help other people solve problems. My retirement, which had initially seemed like a gradual withdrawal from active engagement with the world, had instead become a period of increased involvement and influence. The harassment that was intended to make me feel powerless and isolated had actually connected me more deeply with my community and given me a greater sense of purpose and effectiveness. The security system that had captured Jessica's threats continued to serve its protective function, but it had also become a symbol of something larger, about refusing to be victimized and taking control of situations that others might see as hopeless. The recordings that had provided evidence of harassment also documented the transformation of a neighborhood and the emergence of community connections that might not have developed otherwise. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Jessica's harassment had inadvertently given me gifts I never would have received otherwise. The challenge of defending myself had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. The process of fighting back had connected me with neighbors I might never have met. The resolution of the conflict had established me as someone who could be counted on to help others facing similar challenges. At an age when many people begin to feel marginalized and irrelevant, I had discovered that I was more relevant and more capable than ever before. The attempt to intimidate me into disappearing from my community had instead made me more visible, more connected, and more influential than I had been in years. The woman who had threatened that my time was up had been wrong in ways she never could have imagined. Instead of ending my active participation in community life, her harassment had marked the beginning of a new chapter, where I was more engaged, more empowered, and more determined to use my experience and skills to help create the kind of neighborhood where everyone could live with dignity and respect. The security cameras that had recorded her threats were still running, still protecting me and documenting the positive changes that had emerged from confronting intimidation with preparation, evidence, and determination. The technology that had captured her attempts to destroy my peace of mind had instead preserved evidence of my refusal to be victimized, and my commitment to fighting back against anyone who tried to take advantage of perceived weakness. At 72, I wasn't slowing down or stepping back. I was moving forward with greater confidence, broader influence, and deeper community connections than I had ever experienced before. The harassment that was supposed to drive me away had instead helped me discover that this was exactly where I belonged, and exactly who I was meant to be. The transformation that began with Jessica's settlement extended far beyond what I had anticipated, reshaping not only our immediate neighborhood, but creating ripple effects throughout Riverside and beyond. What started as one elderly woman defending herself against harassment evolved into something approaching a movement, though I never intended to become any kind of activist or community leader. The success of my documentation strategy and the comprehensive resolution of Jessica's harassment campaign attracted attention from sources I never expected. 3 months after the settlement, I received a call from Detective Maria Gonzalez with the Riverside Police Department's Elder Abuse Prevention Unit, a Division I hadn't even known existed. Detective Gonzalez explained that my case had been flagged in their system as an example of particularly effective evidence gathering and victim advocacy. "Mrs. Chen, we've been reviewing the documentation you provided in the Martinez case, and frankly, it's some of the most thorough evidence collection we've seen in a harassment situation," Detective Gonzalez told me during our phone conversation. "We'd like to discuss whether you'd be interested in sharing your experience with other residents who are dealing with similar issues." The police department had been struggling with elder harassment cases because victims often lacked the evidence needed to support their complaints. Many elderly residents didn't understand what constituted legally actionable harassment, didn't know how to document incidents properly, and frequently felt too intimidated or embarrassed to pursue formal complaints. My case had demonstrated that with proper preparation and documentation, even the most vulnerable residents could successfully defend themselves against systematic harassment. Detective Gonzalez invited me to participate in a community education program the police department was developing to help elderly residents protect themselves from various forms of exploitation and harassment. The program would teach practical skills like basic security technology, evidence documentation, and when to involve law enforcement in neighbor disputes. Initially, I was hesitant about taking on any kind of public role. At 72, I had never seen myself as someone who would be teaching others or speaking to groups about my experiences. But Detective Gonzalez explained that my story had already inspired several other residents to take action against harassment they had been enduring silently, and that my practical approach to documentation and evidence gathering could help many more people. The first community workshop I participated in was held at the Riverside Senior Center on a Thursday evening in late February. I expected maybe 15 or 20 people to attend, but the meeting room was packed with over 60 residents, ranging in age from their 60s to their 90s. Many had brought notebooks and were clearly serious about learning practical strategies for self-protection. Detective Gonzalez introduced me and provided background on my case without revealing private details about Jessica or the specific harassment I had endured. She focused on the methods I had used to document incidents, the technology tools I had employed, and the legal strategies that had led to successful resolution. When I began speaking, I was nervous about addressing such a large group, but the audience was so engaged and responsive that my anxiety quickly faded. I explained how I had identified the need for better documentation, researched security systems, learned to operate recording technology, and built a comprehensive case that could withstand legal scrutiny. The questions from the audience revealed that harassment of elderly residents was far more common than I had realized. Woman after woman shared stories of neighbors who played loud music late at night, left threatening notes on cars, made disparaging comments about property maintenance, or filed frivolous complaints with city agencies. Several men described contractors who had tried to overcharge them, landlords who had attempted to force them from rent-controlled apartments, and even family members who had tried to pressure them into financial arrangements that weren't in their best interests. Most disturbing were the stories about healthcare providers, service technicians, and professional caregivers who had taken advantage of elderly clients because they assumed their victims wouldn't be able to document misconduct or wouldn't know how to file effective complaints. The scope of exploitation and harassment targeting seniors was much broader and more systematic than I had understood. What struck me most about the audience responses was how many people had been enduring harassment silently because they didn't believe anyone would take their complaints seriously, or because they didn't know how to gather the evidence needed to support their concerns. Many had been told by adult children, healthcare providers, or social service workers that their complaints were probably misunderstandings or exaggerations, leading them to doubt their own perceptions and accept treatment that was clearly unacceptable. The second workshop, held 3 weeks later, focused specifically on technology tools for self-protection and evidence gathering. I had partnered with Carlos, the security system technician who had installed my equipment, to provide hands-on demonstrations of recording devices, smartphone apps for documentation, and cloud storage systems that could preserve evidence safely. The response to the technology workshop exceeded all expectations. Over 80 people attended, including several who had driven from neighboring communities after hearing about the program through word of mouth. We had participants ranging from tech-savvy retirees who wanted to upgrade their existing security systems to people who had never used smartphones and needed basic instruction on recording video or taking photographs. Carlos proved to be an excellent instructor, patient and clear in explaining technical concepts without condescending to his elderly audience. He demonstrated doorbell cameras, motion-activated recording devices, and smartphone apps designed specifically for incident documentation. Most importantly, he taught participants how to access and preserve their recordings in ways that would be legally admissible if they ever needed to pursue formal complaints. The workshop also included a segment on recognizing different types of harassment and understanding when incidents cross the line from annoying behavior into legally actionable misconduct. Many participants had been tolerating behavior they didn't realize was illegal because they assumed that harassment had to involve physical threats or violence to warrant police intervention. By the third workshop in April, we had expanded the program to include legal advocacy training, led by Rebecca Santos and several other attorneys who specialized in elder law. The legal component covered topics like restraining orders, civil harassment, complaints, and how to work effectively with law enforcement when filing reports about ongoing harassment. The legal training proved to be transformational for many participants. People who had felt powerless against harassment discovered that they had legal rights and practical remedies available to them. Several attendees began pursuing cases against neighbors, service providers, and even family members who had been taking advantage of them for months or years. One particularly memorable success story involved Martha Williams, an 81-year-old widow who had been dealing with harassment from her apartment building's maintenance supervisor. He had been entering her unit without proper notice, making inappropriate comments about her appearance, and threatening to report her for lease violations when she complained about his behavior. Martha had been considering moving from the apartment she loved because she felt unsafe and didn't know how to address the harassment. After attending our workshops, she installed a simple recording device in her apartment, documented several incidents of inappropriate entry and threatening behavior, and filed complaints with both building management and local housing authorities. The maintenance supervisor was terminated within 2 weeks of Martha's documented complaints, and the building management company implemented new policies for unit access and resident safety. Martha not only got to keep her apartment but also received a formal apology and a reduction in her rent as compensation for the harassment she had endured. Success stories like Martha's began generating media attention that I hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely comfortable with. A reporter from the Riverside Press Enterprise wrote a feature article about our community education program, focusing on how elderly residents were using technology and legal advocacy to fight back against various forms of exploitation. The article, titled "Silver-Haired Advocates, Seniors Fight Back Against Harassment," included several case studies of workshop participants who had successfully resolved harassment situations using documentation and legal strategies. The piece portrayed elderly residents as resourceful and empowered, rather than vulnerable and helpless, challenging common stereotypes about aging and capability. The media coverage led to invitations for me to speak at other senior centers throughout Southern California. Within 6 months, I was traveling regularly to communities in Orange County, San Bernardino, and Los Angeles to present workshops on self-advocacy and harassment prevention for elderly residents. Each community I visited revealed new aspects of the harassment and exploitation problems facing older adults. In affluent areas, the issues often involved property-related harassment from younger neighbors who wanted to upgrade their neighborhoods by forcing out older residents. In lower-income communities, the problems frequently centered around housing discrimination, healthcare fraud, and financial exploitation by service providers who targeted vulnerable populations. The consistency of these problems across different communities convinced me that we were dealing with systematic issues rather than isolated incidents. Somewhere along the way, our society had developed attitudes about elderly people that made them seem like acceptable targets for harassment and exploitation. The assumption that older adults were technologically incompetent, legally naive, and socially isolated had created opportunities for predators who knew their victims were unlikely to fight back effectively. My workshops began evolving to address these broader social issues, in addition to providing practical self-protection strategies. We discussed ageism in healthcare, housing discrimination against seniors, and financial scams specifically designed to target elderly victims. We also explored how older adults could challenge negative stereotypes through their own behavior and advocacy efforts. The most rewarding aspect of this unexpected advocacy work was watching participants discover their own capabilities and strength. People who had felt powerless and vulnerable learned that they had legal rights, technological resources, and community support available to help them address problems they had been enduring alone. 75-year-old Robert Kim, who had been dealing with a contractor trying to pressure him into unnecessary home repairs, used recording apps on his smartphone to document fraud attempts, and ultimately helped police build a case that shut down a predatory home repair scam targeting elderly homeowners throughout his neighborhood. 83-year-old Patricia Santos successfully fought an eviction attempt by her landlord, who wanted to convert her rent-controlled apartment building to condominiums. Using documentation techniques she learned in our workshops, she gathered evidence of improper eviction procedures and worked with legal aid attorneys to secure her right to remain in her home. The individual success stories were gratifying, but the broader cultural impact of our work became apparent when other communities began developing their own elder advocacy programs modeled after our workshops. Senior centers in Arizona, Nevada, and Northern California started offering similar training programs, and several organizations began producing educational materials based on the strategies we had developed. Detective Gonzalez told me that harassment reports from elderly residents had increased significantly since our program began, not because harassment was getting worse, but because more seniors understood what constituted actionable misconduct and felt confident about filing formal complaints. More importantly, the resolution rate for these complaints had improved dramatically, because victims were providing better documentation and evidence to support their cases. The police department began referring to our approach as the Chen method, which simultaneously honored me and embarrassed me. I had never intended to develop a systematic approach to harassment prevention or to become known for advocacy work. I had simply been trying to protect myself from one threatening neighbor, and the success of that effort had grown into something much larger than I ever anticipated. By the end of the year, I was receiving invitations to speak at conferences for law enforcement, social workers, and healthcare providers about effective strategies for supporting elderly victims of harassment and exploitation. The perspective I could offer as someone who had experienced harassment directly and had successfully fought back was apparently valuable to professionals who worked with vulnerable populations but hadn't always understood the most effective approaches to victim empowerment. Speaking to professional audiences was challenging in different ways than working with elderly residents. Healthcare providers and social workers sometimes had preconceived notions about elderly capabilities that made them resistant to strategies that required significant self-advocacy from their clients. Law enforcement officers occasionally seemed skeptical that elderly victims could gather evidence effectively or follow through on legal proceedings. However, the case studies I could present from our workshop participants provided compelling evidence that elderly residents were capable of sophisticated self-advocacy when given appropriate tools and training. The success rates we had achieved in harassment cases, combined with the broader positive impact on community safety and senior empowerment, made our approach difficult to dismiss. The professional presentations also gave me opportunities to advocate for policy changes that would better support elderly victims of harassment and exploitation. I began recommending that law enforcement agencies develop specialized training for officers who handle elder abuse cases, that healthcare providers receive education about recognizing and addressing harassment-related health impacts, and that social service agencies incorporate technology training and legal advocacy into their programs for seniors. One of the most significant policy impacts came when the California Attorney General's office invited me to participate in a task force on elder abuse prevention. The task force was developing statewide recommendations for improving protection and advocacy services for elderly residents. And my experience with technology-based documentation and community education was seen as a potentially scalable model. Working with the task force introduced me to the broader scope of elder abuse and exploitation issues throughout California. The problems I had encountered in Riverside were replicated in communities across the state, often with even more serious consequences for victims who lacked the resources or support systems needed to fight back effectively. The task force's final recommendations included provisions for technology training programs at senior centers, funding for legal advocacy services specifically designed for elderly victims, and improved training for law enforcement officers handling elder abuse cases. Several of the recommendations were directly based on strategies we had developed in our Riverside workshops. Seeing my personal experience with harassment translated into statewide policy recommendations was surreal and gratifying. The threatening neighbor who had tried to drive me from my home had inadvertently contributed to policy changes that would help protect thousands of elderly residents throughout California. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica Martinez's attempt to make me feel powerless and irrelevant had led to me having more influence on public policy than I had ever imagined possible. Her harassment had forced me to develop skills, knowledge, and confidence that had made me a more effective advocate than I could have become through any other path. 2 years after the Halloween night when Jessica threatened me on my own doorstep, I received an unexpected letter from her. She had moved to Arizona with her husband, apparently to start over in a community where her reputation hadn't been damaged by the harassment scandal. The letter was thoughtful and detailed, expressing genuine remorse for her behavior and explaining how the consequences of her actions had led to significant personal growth and changed priorities. Jessica wrote that losing her real estate license and having to rebuild her career from scratch had been devastating initially, but had ultimately forced her to confront personal issues she had been avoiding for years. She had continued with therapy, had become involved in volunteer work with elderly residents, and had developed a completely different understanding of aging, community, and respect for people regardless of their age or perceived vulnerability. Most surprisingly, she mentioned that she had followed news coverage of my advocacy work and felt proud that her victim had become someone who was helping protect other elderly residents from harassment. She acknowledged that her behavior had been inexcusable, but expressed gratitude that I had chosen consequences that allowed her to learn and grow rather than simply punishing her destructively. The letter included a donation to our workshop program and a request that I not feel obligated to respond to her personally, but that I know she was genuinely committed to making amends for the harm she had caused. I never replied to Jessica's letter, but I kept it as a reminder that even the most difficult conflicts could sometimes lead to positive transformations for everyone involved. The success of our harassment prevention program had expanded beyond anything I could have anticipated, but it had also given my retirement a sense of purpose and accomplishment that I treasured. At 74, I was busier, more engaged, and more fulfilled than I had been at any previous point in my life. The security cameras that had recorded Jessica's threats were still functioning perfectly, still protecting my home and providing peace of mind. But they had also become symbols of something much larger, about refusing to be victimized and taking control of situations that initially seemed hopeless. The technology that had captured evidence of harassment had evolved into tools for education, empowerment, and community building. The legal strategies that had resolved my personal conflict had become resources for helping other people fight back against exploitation and intimidation. The neighborhood that had once felt threatened by harassment had become a model of community, solidarity, and mutual support. The relationships that had been forged through shared challenges had created networks of people who looked out for each other and refused to tolerate mistreatment of vulnerable residents. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Jessica's harassment had given me opportunities I never would have pursued otherwise. The challenge of defending myself had revealed capabilities I didn't know I possessed. The process of fighting back had connected me with people and causes that had enriched my life immeasurably. At an age when many people begin to feel that their most significant contributions are behind them, I had discovered that my most meaningful work was just beginning. The experience that was intended to diminish my sense of belonging and relevance had instead established me as someone whose voice mattered, and whose experience could help create positive change in the world. The security system that had documented threats against me continued to record the positive activities and community connections that had emerged from refusing to be intimidated. The evidence of harassment had been replaced by documentation of workshops, advocacy meetings, and the steady stream of visitors who came to learn about self-protection and empowerment strategies. The woman who had told me that my time was up had been spectacularly wrong about both my resilience and my relevance. Instead of ending my active participation in community life, her harassment had marked the beginning of the most productive and influential period of my entire life. At 74, I wasn't slowing down or stepping aside for younger voices. I was using my experience, wisdom, and hard-won knowledge to help create communities where people of all ages could live with dignity, safety, and respect. The harassment that was supposed to silence me had instead amplified my voice and extended my influence far beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. The recording equipment that had captured one woman's threats now preserved evidence of thousands of people learning to protect themselves and stand up for their rights. The technology that had documented my vulnerability had become a tool for demonstrating the power and capability that elderly people possessed when they refused to be dismissed or intimidated. The story that began with harassment and threats had become a narrative about transformation, empowerment, and the unexpected ways that challenges could become opportunities for growth and service. The security system that had protected me from one neighbor's malice had helped create a movement that was protecting vulnerable residents throughout California and beyond. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.